So, picture this. It is the year 2026, and you decide to travel to Kenya.
Okay, I am picturing it.
Right. So you're there, you're on the roads, and you see something that, honestly, it fundamentally rewrites our whole understanding of global power dynamics.
You're talking about the vehicles, right?
Exactly. You aren't just seeing electric vehicles imported from Detroit or, Berlin.
Or even fully assembled ones shipped over from the People's Republic of China.
Right. What you're seeing are electric vehicles where, sure, the complex battery components arrived from Beijing, but the vehicles themselves, they were actually built, assembled, and branded right there in Nairobi.
Which is just a massive shift in how the supply chain works.
It's huge because the terms of that manufacturing deal, they weren't dictated by some foreign superpower telling a developing nation what to do.
No, not at all.
They weren't.
We're aggressively negotiated by an African nation.
Yeah, Kenya basically demanded technology transfers and local industrialization as this steep price of entry into their market.
Which, when you realize that Kenya is dictating the terms of its own green energy revolution to the second largest economy on Earth.
It's wild.
It totally flips the static map of the world we all grew up with completely upside down.
It really shatters the entire framework of how most people evaluate international relations.
Right, because we're so used to seeing things in binary terms.
Exactly. We are so accustomed to viewing global power dynamics through these neat binary lenses, east versus west, north versus south.
The donor versus the recipient.
Yes. But the reality on the ground in Africa right now is the absolute definition of a rapidly evolving geopolitical triangle.
A very complex triangle.
It really is. You have the United States, the People's Republic of China, and the diverse, increasingly unified nations of the African continent all engaged in this constant negotiation of power.
Power, resources, and sovereignty, which is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here for this one. Our mission today is to unpack that exact triangle. We are going to decode the massive diplomatic, economic, and security shifts occurring across the African continent right now in the year 2026.
And for those of you listening, if you've been trying to understand the global supply chain of critical minerals, this is for you.
Or if you're wondering why American foreign policy is undergoing such a dramatic transformation, this is where all those threads pull together.
We have an incredibly rich stack of source material to help us do that today.
We really do. We are analyzing the 2025 and 2026 reports from the AfricaCenter for Strategic Studies.
Those are fantastic reports.
Yeah, very detailed. We are also drawing heavily from a comprehensive study by the RAND Corporation focused specifically on Chinese engagement with Africa.
Which has some really surprising data in it.
It does. We'll get into that. Plus, we have a crucial 2025 brief from the Center for Strategic and International Studies China Power Project.
And we are weaving in direct quotes and analysis from a variety of places.
Right. From Al Jazeera, Foreign Policy Magazine, Voice of America, the National Bureau of Asian Research, the Democracy Center for Transparency.
And an incredibly insightful 2026 economic article from the Nigerian publication Business Day.
It's a phenomenal cross-section of perspectives, honestly.
It is. You are looking at military strategy, granular economic analysis, regional journalism, and high-level diplomatic tracking, all intersecting.
And to truly understand what those sources are telling us, we really have to strip away a lot of our inherent biases.
Absolutely. I approach this as a researcher and a master's level professor specializing in United States and Chinese foreign policy.
Which is exactly why you're here.
Right. But even I find that the data coming out of this triangle in 2026 forces us to constantly reevaluate our baseline assumptions.
Well, I am so thrilled to have your expertise on this.
Oh?
Because to understand the headlines we are seeing today, the electric vehicle factories, the military bases, we cannot start in the present.
No, you have to rewind the clock.
Exactly. If we want to understand why African nations frequently view Beijing through a fundamentally different lens than they view Western nations, we have to look backward.
Because the current relationship didn't just, materialize out of thin air in the 21st century.
Right. It's built on a profoundly deep historical foundation.
The historical context is literally the invisible architecture of every diplomatic meeting happening today.
So let's break that down. Where do we start?
To really grasp this, you have to look at the People's Republic of China's posture back in the mid-20th century.
Okay, so Cold War era.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was heavily defined by Mao Zedong's Three Worlds theory.
The Three Worlds theory, explain how that works, because it's different from the typical Cold War camps, right?
It is entirely different. During the height of the Cold War, the international community was largely pressured to divide itself into two camps.
Right, the United States and its capitalist allies, or the Soviet Union and its communist bloc.
Yeah. But Mao Zedong formulated a completely different geopolitical taxonomy. He categorized the two dominant superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, as the First World.
Wait, he put both of them in the First World?
Yes, he viewed both of them as imperialist hegemons. Then, the developed allies of those superpowers constituted the Second World.
Okay, so where does China fit into this?
The Third World, in his framework, comprised the developing and newly independent nations of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And China placed itself firmly in that category.
Oh, wow. That framing completely changes the narrative.
It does. Instead of China presenting itself as a superpower in waiting that wanted to, conquer or assimilate these smaller nations.
Beijing actually positioned itself as a peer.
Exactly. They were claiming membership in that third world category alongside African nations.
That is a crucial distinction.
It really is. The core of the three worlds theory was an intense focus on anti-imperialism and fostering genuine cooperation across the global south.
So they were basically saying, we are all in this together against the big empires.
Right. Beijing sought to lead a coalition of developing nations that could collectively balance against the influence of the First World empires.
But this wasn't just lofty rhetoric being debated in diplomatic halls, right?
No, not at all. From the 1950s all the way through the 1970s, Beijing translated that theory into active material support for African liberation movements.
Let's get specific about what that material support actually looked like, because our sources highlight several key examples where Beijing was really putting skin in the game.
Oh, they were providing direct ideological backing, but more importantly, real resources and training.
Right, to groups like the Zimbabwe African National Union
And the African National Congress in South Africa.
and even various liberation factions operating within the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Actually, the RAND Corporation study provides a startlingly specific data point here.
What did they find?
In 1974, the People's Republic of China sent Type 59 tanks and military instructors to Zaire, which we now know as the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Wait, they sent actual tanks?
Real heavy armor, yes, to physically train and equip liberation groups.
Consider the impact of that action. I mean, while many Western nations were still viewing the African continent through the lingering lens of colonialism,
Or treating these newly independent nations merely as pawns on a Cold War chessboard.
right, where aid was heavily conditional. Meanwhile, China was delivering heavy armor to help them fight against colonial remnants.
Exactly. Because Western assistance during that era often came with massive strings attached.
Like what kind of strings?
Well, usually a requirement to adopt a specific economic model or a mandate to vote alongside the United States or European powers at the United Nations.
It was heavily paternalistic. It basically functioned as an ultimatum.
We will build you a hospital, but only if you publicly condemn the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and open your markets to our corporations. Contrast that with a developing Asian nation sending military instructors and saying, we are also fighting off the legacy of imperialism. Let's do this together.
It creates a totally different dynamic.
Yeah. I like to think of this strategy through an agricultural analogy. It sounds like Beijing systematically planted an orchard of goodwill decades ago.
I like that.
And they were just diligently watering it while the West was either distracted or being condescending. And now, in 2026, the United States looks around and is completely shocked that China is the one harvesting all the apples.
That orchard analogy is perfectly apt because those roots run incredibly deep.
But how tangible is that history today? I mean, when a modern, highly educated African finance minister sits down with a Chinese diplomat to negotiate a billion-dollar telecommunications contract, does that history actually influence the spreadsheet?
Yes, it really does. The history is both a subtle undercurrent and an explicitly invoked narrative.
How so?
In modern diplomatic engagements, the leadership of the People's Republic of China constantly utilizes a shared language. They talk about mutual respect and non-interference in internal affairs.
And South-South cooperation, right?
Exactly. They deliberately remind their African counterparts of their shared historical struggle against outside forces.
So it buys them an incredible amount of narrative power.
It creates a baseline of trust that Western diplomats often have to spend years just trying to build from scratch.
But obviously, the relationship didn't remain purely ideological.
No, it underwent a massive transition.
The pivot point for that transition seems to be right around the turn of the millennium.
Yeah, the year 2000 was the watershed moment.
That's when this historical solidarity formalized into structural economic entanglement.
With the creation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation.
Right. And how does that forum actually function?
Well, it shifted the dynamic from decentralized ideological support to massive, highly structured economic, political, and eventually security coordination.
It meets every 3 years, doesn't it?
It does, and it serves as the primary mechanism through which China engages with the African continent as a unified bloc.
Even though the actual infrastructure contracts are negotiated bilaterally between China and individual nations?
Correct. The forum sets the overarching agenda, the funding targets, and the geopolitical tone for the relationship.
Which brings us perfectly to the present economic reality. The goodwill orchard has grown into this immense, tangible economic ecosystem.
An ecosystem that is currently experiencing a seismic shift.
Yeah, according to the highly detailed 2026 reports from the AfricaCenter for Strategic Studies, the momentum is now being entirely driven by African demands.
The old model of simply exporting raw materials in exchange for infrastructure loans is totally breaking down.
To understand why that model is breaking down, we really have to dissect China's primary economic imperatives on the continent today.
They essentially have two major driving forces.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, securing a reliable, uninterrupted supply of critical minerals.
Right, because of the global economic transition.
Exactly. The materials required for green energy technologies, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, they are paramount. And the African continent holds these in vast abundance.
Then the second driving force.
China desperately needs massive emerging markets to absorb its finished manufactured products.
Everything from solar panels to consumer electronics.
Precisely.
That makes perfect logical sense from a supply chain perspective, but the narrative in Western media over the last decade has heavily framed this economic relationship as predatory.
Oh, heavily.
If you read standard geopolitical commentary prior to 2025, you constantly encounter the phrase debt trap diplomacy.
It was everywhere.
The prevailing theory was that Beijing intentionally extends massive infrastructure loans to developing nations, fully knowing those nations lack the gross domestic product to service the debt.
The supposed master plan was that when the country inevitably defaults, China swoops in and seizes sovereign assets.
Right, taking ownership of a strategic port or a critical railway line.
That narrative has been incredibly pervasive, shaping policy debates in Washington and European capitals for years.
But the comprehensive study by the RAND Corporation completely upends that assumption, doesn't it?
It absolutely dismantles it. The researchers look closely at the actual data of Chinese lending and sovereign defaults.
And they explicitly debunked the Western debt trap theory.
They did. This is a critical point for anyone analyzing global economics.
So how does the RAND study debunk a theory that has been treated as gospel by Western intelligence agencies?
The RAND analysis demonstrates that the People's Republic of China simply does not possess a unified, deliberate policy to lure borrowing countries into debt traps for the purpose of asset seizure.
So it's not some grand, evil master plan?
No. The reality of Chinese lending is far more chaotic.
Chaotic how?
Well, when an African nation defaults on a loan, the research indicates the failure is typically caused by a profound lack of coordination among a highly fragmented ecosystem of Chinese lenders.
So there isn't just one China bank making these deals?
Exactly. You have state-owned policy banks, provincial commercial banks, and private Chinese enterprises all issuing debt independently.
And they often aren't communicating with one another.
Right. Combine that fragmented lending with, in some cases, local political imprudence or overly optimistic economic forecasting in the borrowing countries.
And you get a debt crisis.
Exactly.
So instead of a cartoonish, predatory loan shark intentionally trying to break your kneecaps so they can take the deed to your house, the situation is much more akin to a disorganized megabank.
I love that analogy.
It's like where the mortgage department, the auto loan department, and the credit card division are all simultaneously issuing debt to the very same customer without ever checking the customer's total income.
That captures the operational reality perfectly. It is a systemic failure of risk assessment, not a deliberate, evil genius geopolitical trap.
It's a failure of due diligence on both sides of the table.
But the vital takeaway for 2026 is how African nations are actually responding to this reality.
Because they're not just passively accepting these debt burdens.
No, they're aggressively pushing back and demanding debt sustainability.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that pushback. If a nation is suffocating under high-interest loans for, say, a massive railway project, how do they actually force a renegotiation with a superpower?
They are heavily utilizing international mechanisms, most notably the Group of 20 Common Framework.
The Group of 20 Common Framework. This was established to help low-income countries restructure their debt, right?
Exactly, and deal with insolvency. African nations are using this forum to force Chinese lenders to sit at the table alongside other international creditors.
So they aren't just negotiating one-on-one in a back room anymore.
No, it's out in the open. They're actively seeking comprehensive debt restructuring.
Extending the maturity dates of the loans, lowering the interest rates.
And in some high-leverage situations, they're demanding total interest-free loan cancellations.
Because African finance ministers are acutely aware that sending massive interest payments to Beijing diverts critical domestic capital away from their own healthcare systems, education, and domestic industrialization.
And that desire for domestic industrialization, that is the true engine of the 2026 economic landscape.
It really is. The most significant shift highlighted in the AfricaCenter for Strategic Studies reports is the absolute refusal of African nations to continue the historical paradigm of raw material extraction.
For centuries, the economic model imposed on the continent was brutally simple.
Extract the raw gold, the crude oil, the unrefined copper, ship it overseas.
And then force the local population to buy back the highly expensive, finished manufactured goods.
But African leaders are now mandating value addition.
And the push for value addition is arguably the most consequential economic policy of the 21st century for the global South.
African nations possess the raw materials for the green energy transition, and they know it.
They are leveraging that monopoly to demand that the processing and manufacturing happen on their soil.
Our sources provide some really striking examples of this regarding the automotive industry.
The electric vehicle revolution is the perfect case study here.
Look at what is happening in Namibia and Ethiopia. Both nations have instituted these really aggressive policies, pushing for the domestic adoption of hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles by the year 2030.
Ethiopia actually took an incredibly drastic step.
What did they do?
They outright banned the import of new combustible engine vehicles to completely force the market to transition.
Wow, that is a bold move. But here's the critical part. They refuse to simply become an export market for finished Chinese vehicles.
They are using access to their internal markets as leverage.
And the situation in Kenya illustrates the real endgame of this strategy.
Because Kenya is actively manufacturing its own domestic line of electric vehicles.
The 2026 data shows that the only components Kenyan manufacturers are currently importing from the People's Republic of China are the complex battery cells.
Everything else, the chassis, the software integration, the assembly, is localized.
And Kenya has publicly stated their roadmap to achieve full-cycle manufacturing, including battery production, within the next few years.
This represents a massive leap up the global value chain. They are moving from miners to manufacturers.
And the main tool they are using to enforce this is the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Exactly. If a foreign corporation, whether from Beijing or anywhere else, wants tariff-free access to a unified market of over 1 billion people,
they can no longer just drop shipping containers full of finished goods at the port.
No. African leaders are demanding local assembly plants, the hiring of local labor, and mandatory technology transfers.
Basically, if you want our lithium and our consumers, you have to bring the intellectual property and the factory with you.
That unified front fundamentally alters the negotiating dynamic.
It does. However, we cannot ignore the significant friction points that remain in this economic relationship.
Right, because while the People's Republic of China has publicly offered tariff-free treatment for almost all goods originating from African nations,
the reality on the ground is starkly different.
Very different. African exporters find it incredibly difficult to penetrate the Chinese domestic market.
Because of an invisible wall of non-tariff barriers.
Non-tariff barriers are fascinating. They sound so bureaucratic, but they are incredibly potent economic weapons.
Let's explain exactly how these function for those listening. Because even if Beijing removes the financial tax, the tariff at the border, an African exporter still faces an impenetrable maze of regulations.
The most prominent examples are phytosanitary restrictions.
Phytosanitary restrictions?
Yes. These are extraordinarily strict health, safety, and biological regulations applied to agricultural products.
Okay, let's walk through an example. Imagine you are a commercial avocado farmer in Kenya.
Okay, a Kenyan avocado farmer.
You have been told that under the new trade agreement, you can sell your avocados in Guangzhou without paying a tariff.
So you think you are about to expand your business massively.
Right. But then the non-tariff barriers hit. To satisfy the phytosanitary restrictions, you might have to prove your farm is completely free of a specific microscopic pest.
And to prove that, you have to pay for a specialized inspector to visit your farm.
But the inspector has to be certified by the Chinese government.
Exactly. Then, the produce must be treated in a highly specific cold chain facility that you probably do not own.
Finally, the export paperwork must be completed in complex legal Mandarin, which requires expensive consultants.
By the time the Kenyan farmer navigates the inspections, the cold chain requirements, and the bureaucratic red tape,
the profit margin has entirely evaporated, and the avocados rot in a warehouse.
overcoming these weak logistics and intentionally cumbersome customs procedures remains a massive point of contention.
African nations are demanding that Beijing streamline these processes if they truly want a balanced trade relationship.
The economics alone could occupy our entire deep dive.
That it really could. But we must follow the trajectory of this investment. Wherever billions of dollars of infrastructure and capital flow, a security apparatus inevitably follows to protect it.
Yes, it does.
We have tracked the historical narrative and the economic evolution, and that leads us directly into examining the expanding security and political footprint of the People's Republic of China on the continent.
This footprint is fundamentally altering the strategic landscape. Global defense analysts are watching this evolution with intense scrutiny.
To understand the scale of Beijing's strategic commitment, look at the diplomatic schedule of the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi.
In January of 2026, he conducted a sweeping tour of the African continent.
And our sources emphasize a staggering statistic regarding that tour. It was his 63rd visit to Africa since 2013.
63 visits. That volume of persistent high-level diplomatic engagement is practically unheard of in modern statecraft.
When the Minister of Foreign Affairs lands for his 63rd visit, what exactly is on his agenda?
He laid out a highly specific 5-point agenda, and it perfectly illustrates how Beijing tightly weaves together its economic, security, and diplomatic ambitions.
Let's hear the point.
The agenda focused on accelerating the implementation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Action Plan.
Okay, that's one.
Consolidating the supply chains for critical minerals, deepening high-level political ties, expanding security cooperation and military modernization efforts with African forces.
And the fifth.
Finally, securing diplomatic support from African nations for China's broader geostrategic initiatives on the global stage.
The security piece of that agenda is where the alarm bells usually ring in Western capitals.
The AfricaCenter for Strategic Studies points to the 2025 to 2027 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Action Plan as containing unprecedented security commitments.
So beyond the rhetoric, what does this tangible security footprint look like today?
Well, the most prominent and frequently discussed element is the military base in Djibouti.
Right, the base in Djibouti.
This facility is highly significant because it represents the People's Liberation Army's first permanent overseas military base.
And it's positioned at one of the world's most critical maritime choke points.
Exactly. But focusing solely on Djibouti misses the broader strategy.
What else are they doing?
China has systematically established dual-use satellite tracking facilities across the continent.
And even more critically, the RAND Corporation study highlights something really concerning about commercial ports.
Yes, Chinese state-owned enterprises now hold financial stakes in one or more commercial port terminals across 30 different African countries.
We have to pause and dissect that. Financial stakes in commercial port terminals across 30 nations.
It's massive.
You brought up the concept of dual-use facilities. Let's define that for the listener.
Sure.
If a Chinese construction firm builds a massive deep-water port in West Africa, ostensibly for shipping commercial goods like textiles or minerals, the dual-use concept implies that the port is actually engineered with the capacity to harbor, resupply, and service Chinese military naval vessels.
That is correct.
So the big question is, are African leaders fully aware of this when they sign the contracts?
That is the most critical question regarding African sovereignty in this dynamic.
Right. Is Beijing deploying a geopolitical Trojan horse, secretly sneaking military infrastructure into commercial deals, or is this a mutually understood arrangement?
The evidence strongly suggests it is rarely a Trojan horse scenario.
Really?
Yeah. Rather, it is a calculated, eyes-wide-open arrangement driven by sheer economic necessity.
Explain that.
Think about it. An African nation urgently requires a modernized, deep-water port to integrate into the global economy and facilitate the African continental free trade area.
They need it to survive economically.
Exactly. Traditional Western financial institutions might decline the loan due to risk profiles or environmental concerns.
So they're stuck.
Until China steps in, offering the financing, the engineering, and the construction labor. However, embedded within the contract are clauses that quietly ensure Chinese naval vessels have guaranteed docking rights.
Priority resupply access and use of the logistical facilities.
Yes.
So an African president looks at the deal and makes a pragmatic calculation.
They get the commercial port their economy desperately needs right now to create jobs and boost exports.
And they just accept the secondary long-term security implications, the presence of foreign military vessels as the necessary cost of doing business.
Precisely. They are prioritizing immediate, tangible economic development over abstract future geostrategic concerns.
But Beijing uses the leverage generated by these infrastructure investments to achieve very specific political goals, right?
They do, primarily garnering unwavering support for its core sovereignty issues in international arenas like the United Nations.
The most glaring example of this political consolidation is the diplomatic isolation of Taiwan.
The success of that isolation strategy on the African continent is absolute.
It really is. Out of the 54 sovereign nations in Africa, only one single country is not a member of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation.
And that is Eswatini.
Right, Eswatini. And their exclusion is strictly because Eswatini maintains formal diplomatic recognition of Taipei over Beijing.
Every other nation on the entire continent has severed formal ties with Taiwan and aligned diplomatically with the People's Republic of China.
That represents a profound level of political consolidation achieved almost entirely through the leverage of infrastructure and economic partnerships.
It really does. But there is a ceiling to how far African nations will allow this security relationship to escalate.
Right, they aren't just handing over the keys.
China frequently uses the continent as a testing ground for its global security initiative, proposing deeper integrations. However, the African Union Commission has drawn a very firm, unambiguous line in the sand.
Where exactly does the African Union draw that line? Because if they are accepting military bases in Djibouti and dual-use ports in 30 countries, what won't they accept?
The African Union Commission maintains a strict strategic posture against allowing the continent to be dragged into the geostrategic orbits or proxy wars of any superpower.
So they will take the help, but they won't pick a side in a global war.
Exactly. African defense ministries are highly eager to accept professional military education, logistical training, peacekeeping support, and telecommunications infrastructure from China.
They welcome the capacity building.
Yes. But they fiercely resist Beijing or any foreign power taking on a heavy combat posture or establishing massive troop deployments on their soil.
They refuse to let their territories become proxy battlefields.
And they refuse to sign mutual defense treaties that would permanently alienate the United States or Europe.
It is an incredibly delicate balancing act. They want the tactical training, the armored vehicles, and the radar systems.
But they refuse to be the infantry in someone else's global chess match.
Which forces us to look at the other major player on the board. We have analyzed the historical groundwork, the economic evolution, and the expanding security footprint of Beijing. Now, we must pivot to the reaction from Washington.
Because the United States is deeply embedded in what the Democracy Center for Transparency describes as the new scramble for Africa.
And the American strategy in 2026 looks vastly different than it did just a few years ago.
The shift in United States foreign policy is drastic, and it is meticulously detailed in the brief from the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
For decades, American influence on the continent was primarily defined by humanitarian assistance, health initiatives, and democracy building.
But the sources point to a seismic institutional change: the closure of the United States Agency for International Development.
For anyone who has followed international relations, the closure of the United States Agency for International Development is staggering.
It really is a massive shift.
For half a century, that agency was the premier face of American soft power globally. It was the organization building clinics, supporting agricultural development, and funding civil society programs.
Right.
Why would Washington intentionally dismantle its primary vehicle for traditional foreign aid?
To comprehend the rationale behind that closure, you have to look at the diplomatic friction that came to a head during a pivotal July 2025 summit.
The summit with United States President Donald Trump.
Yes, he hosted the leaders of 5 African nations at this summit: Senegal, Mauritania, Liberia, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau.
And the mood of that summit really encapsulated the frustration of the Global South with traditional Western diplomacy.
There is a specific pointed quote from the president of Gabon, President Nguema, that highlights this frustration perfectly.
What did he say?
He looked at the American delegation and stated plainly, "Invest, or other countries might come instead of you."
Invest, or other countries might come instead of you. That is so direct.
That single sentence forced a complete reevaluation in Washington. The United States recognized that arriving at diplomatic summits to deliver lectures on democratic norms, good governance, and anti-corruption, accompanied by small-scale humanitarian grants, was failing completely.
It just couldn't compete with a Chinese delegation arriving with blueprints and full financing for a multi-billion-dollar hydroelectric dam or a high-speed railway.
African leaders were demanding transactional, hard infrastructure investments. Consequently, the new United States approach attempted a massive pivot.
A pivot to align with Beijing's long-held, highly successful motto of trade instead of aid.
Exactly.
The irony here is so thick. In a desperate attempt to compete with China's influence, the United States essentially decided to copy China's business-first playbook by shuttering traditional aid organizations like the United States Agency for International Development.
That's exactly what happened.
But does abandoning the moral high ground of good governance and civil society support actually yield strategic results, or does it just create new vulnerabilities?
Well, that question is driving fierce debate among foreign policy analysts right now.
Because the intention was to pivot toward facilitating massive private sector American investments to rival Chinese state-owned enterprises.
However, closing the United States Agency for International Development and halting legacy governance programs created an immediate, massive vacuum in soft power and public diplomacy.
And as we know, geopolitical nature abhors a vacuum.
It does.
If the United States pulls its funding from an agricultural reform program or a local journalism initiative, someone else steps in to fill the void and claim the narrative.
And the Center for Strategic and International Studies brief explicitly notes that China is actively leveraging this resulting vacuum.
They are stepping right in.
Furthermore, Beijing is highly adept at capitalizing on controversial United States foreign policy decisions to undermine Washington's credibility.
A prime example highlighted in the sources is the geopolitical fallout from United States vetoes at the United Nations regarding the Israel-Gaza conflict. How does a conflict in the Middle East directly impact the diplomatic triangle in Africa?
It is entirely about the global narrative. Chinese diplomats point directly to those United States vetoes during their meetings with African leaders.
What do they tell them?
They construct a narrative, arguing that Washington's commitment to human rights and international law is entirely conditional and hypocritical. Beijing uses these moments to argue to the global South the United States does not truly care about the lives of developing populations or international humanitarian norms when those norms conflict with the interests of their strategic allies.
Therefore, you cannot trust them as a partner.
Exactly. This rhetorical strategy has been remarkably effective at eroding the traditional American narrative of moral leadership.
So if the United States is stepping back from traditional humanitarian aid and they are losing ground in the public diplomacy narrative, where exactly is Washington focusing its tangible resources on the African continent in 2026?
The definitive answer is security.
Security.
While the United States attempts to shift economic engagement to the private sector, its primary governmental footprint is spearheaded by the United States Africa Command.
This combatant command was established in 2007.
Yes, and it is uniquely headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, rather than on the continent itself.
What does the operational reality of the United States Africa Command look like? I mean, they aren't building ports or railways. What are they physically doing on the ground?
Their operational focus is overwhelmingly weighted toward anti-terrorism and regional stability operations.
The sources detail the continuous deployment of United States Special Operations Forces working in intimate tactical partnerships with the militaries of allied African nations.
A primary focal point is Nigeria and the broader West African region.
Right. The United States Africa Command partners with the Nigerian military to provide intelligence, training, and logistical support.
Aimed at containing, degrading, and dismantling violent extremist organizations such as Boko Haram and the Islamic State's West Africa province.
And this strategy relies heavily on continuous joint military exercises. The sources specifically mention large-scale, multinational operations like Flintlock and Obangame Express.
Yes. The philosophy behind exercises like Flintlock is tactical capacity building.
The United States military believes that the most effective way to secure long-term influence and regional stability is to train African militaries to independently handle their own internal security threats.
The logic makes sense. You cannot have a thriving economy or foreign investment if insurgents control the highways.
But this creates a stark highly visible contrast in how the two superpowers operate on the continent.
It's an incredible juxtaposition.
It really is. On one side of the continent, you have Chinese delegations conducting massive ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new telecommunications networks, deep water ports, and solar farms.
And on the other side, you have the United States military conducting quiet, tactical counterterrorism drills with special forces in the Sahel.
It is easy to see why the infrastructure projects generate more immediate political goodwill among the population.
Oh, definitely. Which brings us to the most critical yet frequently overlooked perspective in this entire dynamic.
African agency.
Yes.
We have spent an enormous amount of time analyzing Beijing's playbook and dissecting Washington's pivot. But the African nations are not passive pawns, merely reacting to the moves of two foreign superpowers.
No, they are actively managing, manipulating, and leveraging this rivalry for their own benefit. Understanding African agency is the master key to decoding 2026 geopolitics.
In international relations theory, analysts frequently invoke the concept of the Thucydides trap.
Right. This theory posits that severe, often violent conflict is inevitable when a rapidly emerging power, in this case the People's Republic of China, threatens to displace an established, dominant, great power in the United States.
And for years, analysts assumed Africa would merely be the collateral damage in this trap.
But instead, African nations are actively navigating right through the center of it, using the friction to generate momentum.
There is a quote from Rwandan President Paul Kagame that I believe should be the required opening text for any study of modern African diplomacy.
It's a great quote.
He stated unequivocally that Africans do not view themselves as victims of economic exploitation. Instead, they view themselves as equal partners demanding mutual respect on the global stage.
When you internalize that mindset, the entire map shifts. African leaders are not seeking saviors from Washington or benefactors from Beijing. They are seeking maximum leverage.
Foreign Policy magazine published a brilliant piece of analysis that captures this perfectly. The headline boldly argued, "A little great power competition is healthy for Africa."
On the surface, that sounds totally counterintuitive.
It does. How can being caught in the crossfire of an escalating rivalry between the two most powerful nations on Earth possibly be considered healthy for a developing continent?
Because fierce competition destroys monopolies, and it forces both the United States and China to offer significantly better terms.
Right. If Beijing knows that Washington is actively trying to facilitate private sector financing for a massive critical minerals refinery,
Chinese state-owned banks are suddenly forced to lower their interest rates and concede to local labor demands to win the contract.
conversely, if Washington knows that Beijing is offering a comprehensive infrastructure package,
American diplomats can no longer arrive empty-handed, offering only lectures on governance. They are forced to bring real, tangible capital and technology transfers to the table.
the rivalry turns African nations into highly sought-after swing voters in the global economy.
I think the best way to visualize this is through a telecommunications analogy.
Oh, I have a good one for this. For decades, it felt like African nations only had access to one terrible internet service provider.
Which is the legacy of colonial and heavily conditional Western aid.
Exactly. The service was highly expensive, the customer service was paternalistic and condescending, and the provider constantly dictated which websites you were allowed to view.
Meaning they dictated your domestic economic policies.
Right. Then, suddenly, a brand new provider entered the market, China.
And this new provider offered blazing fast fiber optic internet at rock-bottom prices.
And they didn't care what websites you visited. Naturally, everyone signed up. But eventually, the customers realized there were some concerning hidden clauses in the terms of service regarding data collection and debt structures.
So now, the original provider of the West is desperately trying to win back market share by matching the rates and dropping the restrictive conditions.
It's a buyer's market.
That analogy is brilliant. But the most important element is the evolution of the customer. The African nations are no longer just signing the contract without reading it.
No, they possess the legal and institutional capacity to scrutinize every line of the terms of service.
They're actively monitoring these massive billion-dollar infrastructure projects to rigorously protect their sovereignty and their environment.
How exactly is that monitoring executed? Auditing a multi-billion-dollar railway project spanning hundreds of miles, financed by a foreign state-owned bank. That seems like an insurmountable bureaucratic challenge.
It is an immense challenge, but they are systematically building the institutional frameworks required to do it. The source material highlights several specific mechanisms.
What's the most prominent one?
At the international level, It's the African Peer Review Mechanism.
Originally, this framework was designed internally by African nations to evaluate each other's domestic governance and democratic standards, wasn't it?
Yes, but it has been strategically expanded. They are now using this mechanism to collectively assess the transparency, the environmental impact, and the financial sustainability of foreign partnerships.
Heavily focusing on projects funded by Chinese capital.
Exactly.
So instead of a Western non-governmental organization coming in to audit a project, the nations are auditing each other.
They are sharing best practices and warning each other about predatory lending terms, ensuring no single nation accepts a deal that undercuts the region's leverage.
And this oversight is happening aggressively at the national level as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Governments in nations like Kenya, Ghana, and Ethiopia have established highly specialized interministerial task forces.
And these task forces exist solely to oversee, regulate, and enforce the contracts of Chinese-financed infrastructure projects.
They do not just sign the deal and walk away. They track the daily construction progress. They enforce the local hiring quotas. And they rigorously evaluate the socioeconomic impacts on the surrounding communities.
And crucially, the sources note that it is not just the government bureaucrats doing the watching. Civil society organizations are playing a massive role.
They really are. Local think tanks, academic research institutions, and grassroots civil society organizations are providing fierce, independent scrutiny of this bilateral cooperation.
They are not intimidated by the scale of the projects.
Not at all. They are specifically hunting for environmental degradation, violations of local labor laws, and any lack of financial transparency in the procurement processes.
When they find violations, they bring these issues loudly to the public square.
Which forces their own governments to demand better standards, stricter compliance, and financial restitution from the Chinese contractors.
So put yourself in the shoes of an African head of state in 2026. What does it actually take to successfully navigate this geopolitical minefield without surrendering your national sovereignty?
It's tough.
You are facing immense domestic pressure from a young, rapidly growing population demanding immediate jobs, reliable electricity, and modern infrastructure.
And you have Beijing sitting across the table offering a blank check to build that infrastructure, but the check comes with hidden clauses regarding port access and diplomatic alignment.
And on the other side, you have Washington offering elite security support to fight terrorism, but demanding transactional loyalty and a rejection of Chinese technology.
Navigating that triangle requires an extraordinary level of diplomatic sophistication, nerves of steel, and, most importantly, robust institutional capacity.
The overarching strategy, the ultimate endgame as articulated by the African Union looking ahead to the 2027 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, is a definitive shift.
A shift away from being a passive recipient of aid or loans toward a model of true co-development.
Let's define co-development. What does that mean in practical terms? It implies they want real skin in the game.
It means the era of the turnkey project is over.
They no longer want to simply be the recipient of a Chinese sovereign loan, which is then used to hire a Chinese state-owned enterprise, to bring in Chinese laborers, to build a railway that is ultimately owned by the Chinese bank until the debt is paid.
Exactly. Instead, African leaders are demanding that their own domestic institutions, specifically African multilateral financial institutions like the African Development Bank, act as formal co-financiers on these massive projects.
That fundamentally changes the power dynamic.
It really does. If an African financial institution holds half the equity and underwrites half the debt, they maintain operational control.
The foreign entity cannot seize the asset in a default scenario because the domestic institution owns the controlling stake. It is a structural firewall against dependency.
That is the exact strategy. It ensures that the project serves the domestic economy first and the foreign investors second.
But the source material is very clear-eyed about the intense challenges African nations face in executing this strategy.
Yes. What are the primary roadblocks preventing them from achieving this co-development model universally?
Well, the obstacles are significant. The primary hurdles include weak institutional capacity in certain developing bureaucracies and constantly shifting domestic political priorities due to frequent electoral cycles.
Also, inadequate access to reliable, independent economic data and severe bureaucratic inefficiencies.
You can design the most rigorous oversight mechanism and the most equitable co-financing structure on paper.
But if the local interministerial task force lacks the funding, the technical expertise, or the political independence to actually audit the accounting books of a massive port project, the mechanism fails and leverage is lost.
It is a race between their growing diplomatic ambitions and their institutional capacity to enforce those ambitions.
Yeah, it really is.
Let's take a step back and look at the entirety of the map we have just redrawn.
A lot of ground we covered.
Over the course of this deep dive, we have unpacked an incredibly complex, constantly shifting geopolitical triangle. We started by digging into the historical groundwork.
Understanding how Beijing planted that orchard of goodwill by actively supporting liberation movements in the mid-20th century, while the West was often bogged down in Cold War conditionalities.
We then analyzed the massive economic evolution, dismantling the simplified Western debt trap narrative.
And examining the reality of African nations demanding debt restructuring, value-added economics, and local manufacturing.
Which is best exemplified by the push for domestically built electric vehicles.
We also scrutinized the expanding, highly strategic security footprint of Beijing.
Analyzing the implications of dual-use commercial ports across 30 countries and the diplomatic isolation of Taiwan.
And we contrasted that footprint with the drastic pivot in United States strategy.
Examining the closure of traditional soft power institutions like the United States Agency for International Development in favor of a transactional, security-heavy approach led by the United States Africa Command.
Focusing on special operations and anti-terrorism.
And finally, we explored the most vital dynamic, how African nations are utilizing this era of great power competition, effectively weaponizing the Thucydides trap to demand true co-development, technology transfers, and mutual respect on the global stage.
When you synthesize all of these distinct data points, the military bases, the critical mineral supply chains, the debt restructuring negotiations, it leaves us with a fascinating, highly provocative question that the global community has not yet fully reckoned with.
What is that final thought you were leaving us with?
Well, for decades, analysts in Washington and Beijing have obsessively debated which of their two capitals will ultimately win this new scramble and control the 21st century. Yeah. But consider the trajectory of the data we just analyzed. As African nations successfully build and control their own advanced manufacturing for electric vehicles, as they assert sovereign control over the critical minerals required for the global green energy transition, and as they forcefully unify their massive internal markets, will the true dominant global superpower of the late 21st century not be the United States and not be the People's Republic of China, but rather a fully integrated African continental free trade area that has the economic leverage to dictate its own terms to the rest of the world?
That is a staggering thought that entirely reframes every headline we read. If the continent unifies its economic leverage, the rest of the world will simply have to fall in line.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for bringing your expertise and helping us navigate this massive geopolitical shift today.
It was my pleasure.
And to you, listening, we hope this deep dive has provided the critical context you need to look past the oversimplified binary narratives. Keep asking the hard questions about the supply chains of the technology you use. Keep investigating the historical roots behind modern diplomatic treaties. And as always, keep questioning the geopolitical narratives you are handed. We will see you next time.